The Tartaria conspiracy theory community has gotten completely out of control. I remember coming across the modern online narratives about Tartaria about 6 or 7 years ago when I was researching theories about Tesla and lost ancient technology. The idea is that Tesla was basing his electricity generating concepts off of much older technologies that fell out of favor or were maybe even intentionally decommissioned by the powers that be sometime in the mid to late 1700s. 6 or 7 years ago, the Tartaria community was pretty small. There were only really a handful of fringe channels on YouTube, for example, that were even talking about it. But last time I checked, the subreddit for Tartaria has about 55,000 people on it, and the subreddit for Tartarian technology has about 15,000 people. And it's not that I don't believe that Tartaria deserves to be talked about online. I am just shocked and kind of confused by all of the things that people are trying to attribute to Tartaria. There does appear to be a little bit of evidence that there was a previous civilization before ours, or at least a previous paradigm before the one we're currently living in, where things in the Western world used to be different. Our technology was different, our society was different, our culture was different. Some people have even taken to calling this lost time period as the 1,000-year reign of Christ. But the kicker is that somehow a lot of these online theorists surmise that the previous civilizational paradigm was ruled by Tartaria. Tartaria somehow created and ruled over a worldwide free energy civilization, but after the paradigm shift between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, free energy was replaced by the oil industry, and spiritual enlightenment and homogeny with nature was replaced by corporations and oligarchs. Maybe certain aspects of this theory could be true. Maybe not. I already have an entire video giving my take on the old world free energy theory, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit more in a future video. But this video is not really about that. For those of you that have never really heard of the Tartaria thing before, Tartary was the name that European map makers gave to various regions spanning from Eastern Europe all the way across the Middle East and Asia between the 13th and 18th centuries. The name Tartary was basically used as a pejorative, or maybe even as a derogatory term to describe these regions to imply that they were untamed wildlands. Depending on who made the map and the time period the map was produced, there are a lot of different ways that maps would break up the Tartarian regions and depict its occupants. The perspective that most Europeans had of Tartary at the time was that it was occupied by uncivilized, barbarian-like wild people, and that the entire land was unsafe for travelers and unfriendly to Europeans and Africans. As far as Europeans were concerned, they believed that Tartary was occupied by marauders, war bands, and bandits who freely roamed the land. Now, a lot of information about Tartary was actively erased from history, and the massive online community of conspiracy theorists that believe Tartary, or Tartaria as they call it, was the master of the previous civilizational paradigm, and that the reason that Tartarian history was erased was to cover up that they used to rule the world and were masters of higher technology.
In today's video, I am going to discuss the mind-blowing Tartaria, a lost civilization which seems to have been forgotten or erased. Tartaria was apparently once where a very spiritual and technologically advanced civilization existed. It was well known as the Golden Empire and covered most of the Northern Asian continent. Originally, a location had been ruled by the Tatarski Velakani mighty giants, who were essentially from the Aryans. Tartaria was a huge landmass and would have still been the largest today if the mud floods had not destroyed everything.
There are countless content farming channels on YouTube alone that crank out constant content implying that Tartaria built all of the massive structures around the world and that they were masters of old world technology that has been lost to us.
This incredibly advanced culture used free energy systems, grandiose architecture that still exists to this day, using the electromagnetic frequencies of planet Earth to abundantly live in Tartaria.
These people talk about Tartary as if it was the author of a theoretically better civilizational paradigm that was stolen stolen from us. The problem with this conspiracy theory is that even though a lot of Tartarian history was erased and rewritten, a lot of European accounts of interactions with Tartaria still survive today. So with the fragments of their history that we have left, can we say that Tartary was the master of a global civilization that used advanced technology? I don't think so. The word Tartary is a European term that was derived from the name Tatar. The Tatars were a specific ethnic group that used to live on the Mongolian plateau region beginning somewhere around 250 AD. But sometime in the 1200s, the Mongolian Empire formed and they assumed the name Tatar when they had consolidated power in the region. It appears as if very few people in the Mongolian Empire actually referred to themselves as Tatars, and some reports even suggest that the original Tatars were wiped out by the Mongolian Empire sometime in the 13th century. But for the first few decades of the Mongolian Empire, it also seems as if a small group of the ruling class referred to themselves as Tatars. Either way, the Mongolians, the Mongolian horde, and the citizens of the Mongolian Empire did not like being called Tatars, or Tartars for that matter. There are a few accounts of Europeans who were visiting the Mongolians on different occasions, and they were reprimanded by the Mongolians for calling them Tartars. It seems as if the Mongolians despised that term. Tartar and Tartary were terms created specifically by the Europeans to describe the eastern regions, similar to the way that people today would use the word Orient or Asia to describe the eastern regions. But the vast majority of people that lived in those regions did not refer to themselves as Tartars. What the Europeans referred to as the Tartarian region was very ethnically diverse. So there were a lot of different names that the various ethnicities used to describe themselves, and there were a lot of different languages that they spoke. Today, though, there are still a handful of different ethnic groups across Eurasia that identify as Tatars. In Crimea, for example, you've likely heard of the group of Tatars that live there now. But surprisingly, there's an even larger group of Tatars in the Republic of Tatarstan, also known as Tartaria. Tatarstan is within the boundaries of Russia, part of the Volga district, north of Kazakhstan. But like I said, there are several different groups of Tatars across Eurasia. Very much like the natives of the Americas, there are some similarities among the Tatar groups in Eurasia, as most of them trace their lineage back to the Mongols or to Genghis Khan. But the Tatars are not exactly a single homogenous ethnic group. They each have their own histories, their own traditions, their own identities and expressions. After ethnic Russians, Tatars are the second largest ethnic group in Russia, making up almost 4% of the population of Russia. So the question is, how did the Europeans come to fear the Tatars, and how is it that they chose to see them as a formidable force against the West? Why did Europe demonize the Tatars? Well, the first contact that Europe had with the Tatars was through the Catholic Church. The lens through which the Catholics chose to view the Tatars was through their belief system. They wanted to know if they were a godly people. The very first writing that we have describing the Tatars by a European was actually written by a Catholic bishop in Hungary in about 1257, and he was writing to another bishop in Paris.
I write back to you about the Tartars. I ask them about their belief, and in a few words, they believe nothing. They began to tell me that they come out of their own country to conquer the world. In whatever manner they invade a country, they slay the inhabitants, except the children, whom Genghis Khan, their lord, which is interpreted as King of Kings, marks with his seal, burning them on the face.
The Hungarian bishop also took time to describe the Tartars' abilities as warriors, describing them as not being very good on foot because their legs are too short, but they're very good archers because their limbs are strong. He warned that they were even better archers than the Hungarians. So this is where we can see that the term Tartar is actually a European bastardization of the name Tatar. And it seems as if this European name for the Tatars could have evolved in a couple of different ways. For example, they already knew the term barbar or barbarian, which was a term that they used to describe similarly wild, untamed, nomadic nomadic people that lived in northwestern Europe. And just like the Tartarians, the Germanic people of Europe did not refer to themselves as barbarians. That was a term created by Rome, again, to demonize them. But the term Tartar ended up sticking with the Europeans because of its association with Tartarus. Tartarus is one of the classical concepts of hell. Tartarus was a place where the wicked were sent to be punished and tormented. But this also displays the fear Westerners felt towards the people of the East, which also likely came from the Roman era, stemming from their dealings with Attila the Hun. So speaking directly to the idea that Tartary was somehow the author of the 1,000-year reign of Christ, that's kind of silly. Genghis Khan did not follow the laws of a god or believe in the sanctity of the divine. Instead, the Tatars believed in the natural law. They only respected brute force and power. Yes, the Tatars had kings and emperors over the centuries, but from the perspective of the Europeans, the Tartarian leaders did not display respect, civility, or fairness. They weren't interested in diplomacy or foreign relations in any way. The Tatars were a warrior people who sought to conquer the world. As the Mongols began to challenge Europe and invade their lands and raid their villages, the Catholics saw the Tartars as a punishment from God. The death and the damage caused by the Tartars was considered to be an extension of God's wrath to punish the Christian Europeans for their failure to live up to God's laws. This is yet another reason that the Tartars were associated with Tartary. It's like they believed that hell was raising up to challenge the Catholic Church. And eventually the Africans too would adopt this same attitude about the Tartars. Like the Europeans, they ended up in constant clashes with the Tatars and even were raided by them several times. Like I said, the core population of the Tatars was mainly Mongolian in the 13th century, but as the Mongolians conquered more land and assimilated more cultures, it became a very ethnically diverse group. During the time of the Golden Horde, there was actually a fairly large group of Turkic-speaking people that had joined the Mongolian Empire. So eventually the Tartarians evolved into a fairly Turkic culture. They would speak primarily Turkic languages and practice Turkic customs. Obviously, there would have been a pretty large crossover between the Tartarian people and the Islamic people, and to a lot of Europeans, they might not have recognized a distinction between the two. I mean, really, from the perspective of the Europeans, they clearly didn't care to recognize any distinction between the Eastern groups. The concept of a large empire of Tartary was not reflective of the nuances of reality. Instead, Tartary became a catch-all term to describe all of the different ethnic groups and nations across the Eastern region. A Grand Tartary never actually existed. It was just a boogeyman created by the Europeans as the way that they chose to understand the people of the East. But today we know that there were hundreds of different ethnic groups within the ranks of the Tatars, with hundreds of different customs and languages. And European accounts of Tartary are so poorly written that we can't even really be sure that any of the ethnic groups across Tartary got along with each other or even had respect for each other. The Europeans just saw them as a giant, dangerous horde of untamed wild people. Later on, closer to the 14th and 15th century, we start to get a little bit of distinction with Tartary in the maps. Mapmakers began breaking up Tartary into different regions, such as Central Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, Little Tartary, and a few others. But even then, these distinctions were made by European observation, so we don't know if these distinctions actually represent any kind of real differences or any real shared cultures within those regions. For all we know, it's because the Europeans who explored those regions decided that the people who live in each of those regions kind of look the same. Each of those different Tartarian regions weren't actually nations or different ethnic groups or kingdoms or anything. Eventually, as the Russians explored more of the East and conquered regions like Siberia and parts of Asia, the term Tartary began falling out of favor. And this is really the main reason why we start to see the term Tartary Tartary being used less and less over time on maps. So how is it that we can go from a time period where Tartary is seen as this large, wild, untamed land of warlike hordes to the modern conspiracy theory that Tartaria was the author of a vast global civilization that had advanced technology and spiritual enlightenment? Well, that's a good question that doesn't really have a good answer, which is why I suggested in an earlier video that the entire Tartarian conspiracy theory could just be Russian propaganda. Basically, this online campaign to push the idea that Tartary was a vast global empire is just exploiting our lack of knowledge of Tartarian history. And really, it's just perpetuating that old ignorance of 13th to 17th century Asia. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Tatars or the Mongolians had access to advanced technology at all. Even during the time period that Tartary existed, the Tatars were always depicted as being nomadic people, people of the horse, people of the land. They're depicted as living in tents, wearing robes and turbans, and moving across their land in hordes. Not a single account of meeting the Tatars ever describes the use of any kind of technology besides bows and arrows. The Tatars were described as warriors, wild people. The Tatars were never described as engineers, and certainly not the builders of impressive structures. But there is one really interesting piece of evidence that suggests that there's something going on with Tartary. A declassified CIA document acknowledges that Tartarian history was intentionally erased and rewritten. This on its own is not very shocking though. Of course, we've all learned that history is written by the victors. Like I said, the Russians, as well as even the Chinese, ended up conquering these lands. And we see this exact kind of thing pretty much play out with every single genocide or major war or conflict throughout history. But the conspiracy theorists love bringing up this declassified CIA document when trying to argue that the great empire of Tartary was erased from history. The problem is that the reason that the CIA gives for Russia and other nations erasing the history of Tartary is to hide the historical conflicts that they had with Russia.
In 1998, the CIA declassified a document which they had produced in 1957. A section within the document mentions the existence of the Tartarian civilization. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten. Let us be frank, was to be falsified in order to eliminate references to the great Russian aggressions and to hide facts of the real center of Tartar-Russian relations.
They erased Tartary's history to hide the fact that it existed in opposition to Russia. It was very important to the Russians that the world saw Tartary as being homogenous with Russian values. At no point in the CIA document does it suggest that they erased Tartary's history because it conflicted with Western views of Tartary. The CIA document doesn't say the reality of Tartary contradicted what the Europeans were saying about them, nor does the document suggest that the Tartarian people were anything more than nomadic archers. Nowhere in the document does it say that all of Tartary was a grand empire, nor does it claim that Tartary had any kind of technology whatsoever. As far as I can tell, the Mongols' technological claim to fame was the compound bow. That's it. They engineered a compound bow that had the same stopping power as a European longbow, but was half the size. And that's really impressive, but that's really different from claiming that they had high technology. The other frustrating part of this conspiracy theory has to do with the maps. The conspiracy theorists are unable to understand that European map makers were simply working off of a cultural bias against the Asians at the time. But either way, think about the logic of their argument here. The conspiracy community wants you to believe that all global knowledge of a vast worldwide empire with advanced technology was completely erased from history. A painstaking process that would have required meticulous commitment to detail. Yet, the people who supposedly wanted to sweep this entire empire under the rug for some reason completely forgot about the maps. The many maps that clearly depict a large Tartarian region. If you were going to go through all the trouble to erase an entire empire from history, why would you forget about the maps? Why would you let the maps endure? Why can we still buy these maps?
Unbelievably, President Vladimir Putin in 2013 made Tartaria maps public, and in 2017 he also gave a map created by William Blah of Tartaria to the former president of Tatarstan.
If the powers that be wanted us to forget about this, why would Google allow us to Google it? Of all corporations, Google would make it impossible for us to find on the internet. It makes no sense. If you've come to believe in the conspiracy theory about Tartaria, it's because your naivety about history and of Tartary has been exploited. Fancy stories have been drummed up to excite your imagination, and it might all sound pretty reasonable to you because you never actually got to learn about Tartary in history class. And not only that, but just the general naivety that everybody has about old map-making practices. Yet you'll find so many of these content farming conspiracy channels spouting absolute nonsense about Tartary as if they know what they're saying, telling you that the Tartarians had advanced technology, just pulling stories out of their ass with no evidence whatsoever.
The extensive golden empire of Tartaria flourished due to their leader believing in advanced occult technology, free energy, and grandiose architecture.
Just mixing images of maps with images of old world buildings and images of Tartars and hoping that you'll make the connection in your brain yourself. I've gotten to the point here where even if it was proven true one day that there really was an advanced civilization that existed before 1812 that ended up getting wiped from history, even if it turned out to be true that the world used to be completely different, it operated under a different paradigm, I would still find it extremely difficult to believe that the Mongols or the Tartars had access to any of this technology. What made the Mongols so difficult for the Europeans to defeat, what made the Tartars such a formidable force against the West, was the fact that they were nomadic. They were not classically civilized. They moved around a lot, which made them a lot harder to track down and find. And it made it a lot easier for the Mongols to move around, to be mobile, to make campaigns against the West without having to worry about getting back to their supply lines. They were used to living off of the land in a way that the Westerners had totally forgotten. And despite the fact that they were nomadic, they still managed to be extremely well organized and extremely good horsemen and archers. They were like a wild card enemy, never in the same place twice. How do you lay siege against a nation that doesn't have castles, that doesn't have fortifications, that doesn't need them? All of the comforts that were so easy to attack and exploit in the West, those were things that the Mongols never knew. Even though they were nomadic, they were still able to build massive, efficient armies. They were still able to build technologically advanced weapons that were extremely effective against Western soldiers. The Tartarians were amazing. They were scary. They were formidable. They were powerful. But the Tartarians did not have free energy. That's a fairy tale. Like I said, I want to do another video about this conspiracy theory, specifically focusing on the free energy structures. I want to address a lot of the confusion about engineering and architecture from that time, because a lot of online sleuths just simply don't understand what they're talking about. I wanted to thank my patrons and my channel members for supporting my work. I could not do this without you. You're amazing.